We are going to move on to our final session today, people. Now, I don't see somebody I'm expecting. Yeah, yes, I do. I found them. Okay. Our final session, I'm going to hand over to Chandni. She will introduce us to our next panel. Is AI a good or a bad thing? Okay, thank you very much. Chandni.
Thank you, Sam, and welcome everyone to the final session of the day. And as Sam said, this is an ethics panel on whether AI is a good or a bad thing. And I'm sure you've heard plenty about this leading up in the past few sessions you've had, but there's been a huge explosion of machine learning, of AI, and it's happening at a very rapid pace. Now, I'm sure you can imagine this brings with it some huge opportunity. So you might already be familiar with technology such as handwriting recognition, Snapchat filters, but also with this opportunity might come some areas of concern. So we know that AI is now being used to make consequential decisions. For example, suppose you have a list of candidates and you need to filter through them to decide which ones to interview. AI is being used for exactly this purpose. Who should we interview? What about in the criminal justice system? There have been studies to decide whether defendants are less likely to reoffend using AI, and comparing that to the decision a judge might make if this was done in person instead. Now, there's a huge amount of complexity into understanding the implications of this. In the situation of the criminal justice system, a judge might be able to take on additional information, such as hearing the arguments a defendant might make, trying to take into consideration additional information which the AI dataset might not include. So which of these might result in a more ethical decision? Now, AI itself might not be implicitly good or bad. It's the training model behind it and the testing that's performed after it's been created that would hugely impact the result of whether this AI is positive or negative. And the truth of this is that humans, in the end of the day, are coding this foundation, the foundations of AI, the foundations of the software, and humans always have biases. Sometimes these biases are exposed, sometimes they're quite subconscious. But what happens if some of these biases unintentionally end up baked into the software? Would we see them magnified? Would we lead to seeing further assertions being made? There's quite a few examples already of where, for example, the CV filtering AI system deemed males to be better candidates for roles, even though the gender was hidden from the CV. And this is because it found certain breaks, employment breaks, to be a negative aspect of a CV. It was unfortunate that women had unemployment breaks far more often than men, usually due to things such as maternity leave. My name's Chandni, and I'm here with a set of fantastic panelists to dive deeper into some of these complex questions. So I'd like to thank all of the panelists today for joining us. We have with us Professor Mark Deisenroth from UCL, machine learning expert Rula Awad, who I believe you met earlier on, and Cisco leader from Senior Corporate Counsel, Casey Shea. Would you like to introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit more about your role and also in and around machine learning? Professor Mark, we can start with you.
Hi, thank you so much for having me here. My name is Mark Deisenroth. I'm a professor at UCL. I do machine learning and AI more or less every day. I also have some other roles at UCL. So I'm Deputy Director of the AI Center at UCL. I'm also the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Lead in CS at UCL. So that's pretty much a very short introduction to myself, and then I'm handing over to Rula, I think.
Hello. I think I introduced myself earlier, so I'll make it brief. I work to detect disinformation, and I work with various different governments and platforms such as TikTok. And I'll hand over to Katie.
Hi, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here with you today. I'm calling in from the United States. I'm based in North Carolina, which is in the southern part of the United States. And I am a lawyer at Cisco. I am responsible for privacy and human rights. And my background before coming to Cisco is in human rights. I worked for a civil society organization for several years. And then I joined the legal team at Yahoo, where I was part of their human rights team. Now at Cisco, I'm building a new function focused on human rights. And part of my job is focused on AI and machine learning. So as I'll talk about throughout the session today, I've been working with colleagues to build a human rights perspective into the way that we build our AI and machine learning technology, and to assess the impacts of our technology on human rights.
Perfect. Thank you, Katie, Mark, and Rula for your introductions, and thank you again for joining us on this panel. I feel like we have so much to discuss and so many interesting points to cover that I'm just going to get right into it with the first question. So we talked a little bit about sort of the opportunities and the different consequences of AI coming out. So my first question is, what do you think are the biggest opportunities for humans and for society coming out of AI at the moment? And Professor Mark, I'll go to you first.
Okay, thanks. So that we have a lot of challenges at the moment and also in the near or medium-term future. So for example, when it comes to climate change, I think AI can play quite an interesting role to help mitigating the climate change. But also in other situations, for example, in healthcare, AI can be quite helpful, especially when it comes to, for example, something like neglected diseases. So these are also called forgotten diseases, where we don't care anymore because they don't affect us on the northern hemisphere. Or if you go to remote locations where you don't have doctors, then machine learning technology can help with diagnosing. But one of the things that we should be very careful about is that we should always think about the benefits and the risks of AI in general. So we always need to ask, who benefits and who bears the risk. And if that kind of like, if this kind of like the benefits are equal to everyone and the risks are distributed equally, I think we are in good shape. But that's not necessarily the case, or it's more or less never the case at the moment. So that's something we should be thinking about. And if you think of maybe one concrete example is the COVID-19 vaccine, right? So we have it now, but it has been tested in the developing world because we don't want to take the risks up here in the Northern Hemisphere. But once it has been approved, the developing world is put at the end of the queue for receiving the vaccine. So it's kind of like this mismatch between who benefits from this and who bears the risk. So this is something we really need to be thinking about when we design AI systems.
Brilliant. Thank you very, very much for that, Mark. And I think what you've said is really incredibly important to ask about the opportunities. It only really makes sense if you keep in mind that equally there are risks involved, and it's all about balance in the end of the day to be able to come to that conclusion. So thank you very much for that answer. Rula, I'm going to hand over to you now. Do you have anything additional to what Mark said in terms of what you think the opportunities coming out of AI are?
I actually think the opportunities are huge. So I would say twofold. I would categorize them into two things. The first is opportunity, innovation and opportunity. So for example, in healthcare, we can now model proteins, which help us drug test more efficiently. And I think this is probably something Mark can speak more of, because I think you guys have worked on that. And then the second is efficiency, like speed of getting stuff done. Like algorithms can do narrow tasks a lot more efficient and faster than humans. And I think it can supercharge kind of the creativity of a human and how we think. So I think those are how I would categorize the opportunity, the positives from machine learning.
Amazing. Thank you very much for that, Rula. And I'd like to hear, Katie, your perspective on this as well, because so far we've heard quite a few examples about sort of the medical field, the biological field. I'd love to know more about sort of your experience and what you think the opportunities from your.
Absolutely. And Mark and Rula's comments really resonate with me. I tend to be very focused on the risks in my job because I'm responsible for figuring out all the things that can go wrong and then trying to work with our teams to mitigate those potential risks. But as they both shared, there are tremendous opportunities in this area. And for Cisco, we tend to be focused on some of the opportunities that Rula mentioned, especially around efficiency. So when we're building AI and machine learning solutions for a platform like the one we're using right now, WebEx, it's often driven around how can we make people more efficient at work, help them do their jobs more effectively, and connect with colleagues in new ways that help them do their job and to help their businesses succeed. We also are in the security business, and we've identified some opportunities for using machine learning to promote secure transfer of information, which I think is really exciting. And we're starting to see, much more information being transmitted across encrypted channels, which limits visibility into potential malware or malicious code that could be transferred along with those encrypted packets. And we have developed a solution called encrypted traffic analytics that uses machine learning to detect the potential of malware without decrypting that traffic. So it's a really innovative solution that promotes security and secure transfer of information, which also happens to be really important for the stakeholders that I'm most concerned about, which is the human rights community. I'll stop there. I could go on and on about potential opportunities, but I'll stop there.
No, that's fantastic to hear from you. And it's great to see the passion as well from all of our panelists here today on sort of what they think these opportunities are and the huge amount of benefit that can come from AI and ML going into the future. But I'd really like to sort of hone in a bit more on what each of you picked up on in your answers there, and that's sort of the element of risk that comes with AI also outbursting the way it has recently. So Katie, if you don't mind, I'll press a little bit more on what you said, because you mentioned using machine learning in order to help recognize risk, but you also mentioned that AI and ML is being used to further disguise risks, and threats as well. So what would you say in general are some of the threats and risks we need to be careful of with AI coming out of society?
I think, for any of these solutions, wherever there's a benefit, there's probably a risk on the other side. So, with some of these security solutions, we worry that they could be misused in ways that, conducting surveillance, for example, or to impact freedom of expression in negative ways. And those are the types of impacts that we really are concerned with at Cisco. So what we're doing to address that is we've created a mechanism where our engineering teams conduct we're calling it a responsible AI and machine learning impact assessment. It's aligned to human rights principles, and it borrows a lot from the privacy field. So they are in that process documenting what the model is intended to do, ways that it could potentially be misused, who the intended population is that would be impacted by the solution, and how they've worked to address potential bias in their own design team, engineering team, in the data that they're using to train the model, et cetera. And so what that process is helping us do is to identify those potential risks early on in the process so that we can identify them. But with any of these solutions, it's really a double-edged sword. Something that could be used for good could also be used for bad. And one example that I'll provide here that I think is top of mind for a lot of people is facial recognition. In the United States, we saw a few different places ban the use of facial recognition by local governments because of the concern that that technology would be used to identify suspects in criminal investigations and, in fact, identify the wrong people, so that people would be wrongfully arrested or incarcerated as a result of flawed models. So those systems ended up getting banned outright, and a lot of people celebrated that decision, but others really criticized it because of some of the benefits that are now foreclosed, such as identifying missing children using facial recognition, for example. So, I think it all comes down to the way that the technology is used, and there are certain things that we can mitigate for in the design process, but ultimately the use is the critical piece.
I think that's a really important point as well you raised there. So there's this element of risk and also lack of trust potentially in these models and whether they'll be accurate enough for the consequence that that AI decision will deliver. And I think it's important, as you said as well, the use case is really important, where the impact of the AI getting it wrong could lead to someone serving a sentence that they're not supposed to because they did nothing wrong, or it could result in finding a missing child. So that use case is really key when deciding the risks, whether they outweigh the benefits. So Mark, I'd like to come to you next, if that's okay. We've talked a little bit about maybe not having trust in these models. What do you think some risks and potential threats around AI coming out in this society are at the moment?
Yeah, so that's a very interesting point. I think Katie already said quite something good about the use of facial recognition. And I think in general, when we apply this kind of technology, we have to think about ethics, fairness, and bias. So the face recognition, right? So you mentioned that already, is cool in video calls, at least if you're a white man. So then it works quite well. It doesn't quite work that well if you're a black woman. So here we need to look at the data collected. You know, if we only use white men in the training data, then this is a biased data set. But also we need to look at whether algorithms are biased by design, so that can happen as well, or who implements the software. It's not uncommon that the majority of software developers is white, straight male. So what do you expect the outcome to be, right? So this is something where we really need to work. But Katie also mentioned ethical AI teams in Cisco. So other companies have them as well. So they also have ethics boards. But the problem is, I mean, it's nice to have them, but they're usually not equipped with any kind of power. So there's a perception that being ethical costs money, and that means loss of revenue. And so you may have read this great piece by Karen Howe in the MIT Tech Review, and how Facebook knowingly optimizes for monetization. So that means click interaction. So somebody mentioned that earlier also in the discussion. And even if that polarizes society up to the point where this can lead to a full-blown genocide. There's also, you know, you can call this maybe ethics washing going on, which means like it's good to be ethical until it requires some significant changes to existing behaviors or processes within an institution. So that's kind of like the problem here is that ethics is currently left as a voluntary exercise. So there's no regulation or oversight in place. And that also means that companies can choose to limit the scope to the ethics team, scope of the ethics team or ethics research team, which Facebook has done, or censor outcomes of the ethics research team. That is what Google has done. And because this is what the shareholders are benefiting from. And similarly, also universities have lukewarm ethics checks in place. I'm not saying the universities are the right places to be. They are lukewarm. And if we are really serious about ethics, then we need some stronger regulations, stronger guidelines, and also external oversight boards. I don't know a single company that has that. So that's kind of like, I think we really need to work much more on the ethics side here.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for those points, Mark. And there's really important points that you've raised here. So it's not only about sort of ethics being something that people need to talk about and do because it's the right thing. There actually needs to be some sort of incentive to make this realistic and practical to implement, and also above and beyond that incentive to make them want to do it, some regulation to make sure it's being done in the right way as well. And that was a great example you gave there as well about how AI can bring some fantastic use cases such as facial recognition, but unless that data model is as diverse as the people that are made to use this technology, there's always going to be that downfall and lack of inclusion there. So thank you very much for that. Rula, I'm not sure if you're still with us. If you can hear us and you're still there, fantastic, I can see you. I just wanted to know if there's anything you have to add to this. Do you think there are some risks that come with AI as well?
So yes, and I would reiterate everything that the panelists, Mark and Katie, have said, but I would add one thing, which is like society evolves, and like history is, you know, an evolving system, and it's really dynamic. And whilst there are risks and we have to mitigate them, and there are biases, like there are also biases in the legal system, in the political system, you know, I would say, in my opinion, lawyers are black boxes, because I have no idea how the law operates or how the law works. In the same way that I would say algorithms can also be black boxes, but they can be less so if they're done or built properly. So whilst it's true there are risks and biases, I would say that it's just a normal process, when it comes to innovation and development, and it's a great thing.
Yeah, absolutely, Rula. I completely agree. Katie, I can see you sort of nodding along and sort of reacting to what Rula's saying. Is there anything you wanted to add on top of that?
Well, I'm a lawyer, so I think I was sort of chuckling at her comment about lawyers being black boxes. And I mean, I think you're absolutely right, Rula, is that a lot of these things are built into the systems that we have today, and that does put us in somewhat of a double bind. When we're thinking about even outside the AI and machine learning context, technology being used in a certain context, like in a law enforcement setting. We have to think, well, can we trust this system to be fair as it exists today? And what are the external factors that are weighing on the potential that this system will perform ethically and in the way that we intend for it to perform? And the bias issue is huge there, right? And because we know that these biases exist in current systems, we have to assume that they're going to get coded into what we're building. So, what we're pushing engineers to do is to proactively think about that and to be aware of it, and to the extent we can code it out, or to work to measure it so that we can address it to the extent that we can. The solutions for addressing that challenge, I think, often are in tension with privacy principles that are also really important to bear in mind when we're designing these systems. And I think that comes up in two ways. One is that, in order to measure bias, you have to have some data about demographic information, including really sensitive information, in order to measure if outcomes are different. So if you're testing a facial recognition system and you want to know, using Mark's example, is this performing better for white men than it is for Black women? You have to know what data you have that corresponds to Black women so that you can measure those outcomes in the testing phase, right? And so to have that information, you have to be collecting sensitive data that's treated differently under GDPR, and that creates different requirements on the company that's collecting that information in terms of the consent to use that information, et cetera. And the other area where this comes up, where it's in tension with privacy, is around collecting the training data in the first place. And we've seen companies get into trouble where they are scraping content from the internet, like taking photos from Flickr or from other public databases, and taking this information and putting it into a training data set. Well, the people who originally uploaded that information had no idea that someone would come along and do that. And that definitely wasn't their intention when they uploaded the data. So one thing that I've been working with our product council and our engineering teams on is really making sure that we know where we're getting our training data from, and that we have the appropriate permissions to use that, because it is personal information that corresponds to individuals. So we need to treat that appropriately and protect it appropriately.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that, Katie. And I think all of this sort of relates a little bit back to why we're all here today as well, in terms of having these sort of events to encourage more diversity within the industry, to make sure we have a more complete set of data that we use to train these AI models. So I want to hone in on that a little bit more. Professor Mark, I'd like to know sort of your opinions on how important is it to have a diverse sort of workforce, and what role do you think that diversity has to play in terms of training good data sets for AI?
That's a good question. I mean, I mentioned this earlier already a little bit when it comes to the diversity in the teams implementing software that we use. I mean, but if we think about this more generally, right? So diversity is important to get different perspectives. There's a lot of research that diversity increases the quality of products, overall productivity, and also the happiness of the workforce. And but diversity in the workforce is not sufficient, right? We also need to empower people. That means we need to give people the power to implement things, to grow within an institution or within a company. So this is important as well. It's not just like having a diverse workforce. And coming to little bit more about talking a bit more about diversity. I think we're talking a lot about gender diversity, but you know, we cannot just talk about male and female. We also need to be inclusive of transgender, non-binary, and gender fluid people, and provide a safe and supportive environment for them as well. And then if we go beyond gender, we need to make sure that we get everyone on board and not only the majorities of the stakeholders, because it's too easy to ignore already marginalized communities such as the Black community or queer people or disabled people. So we need to have a relatively broad perspective on diversity and including people into an environment and empowering everyone and making sure everyone is happy. I think that is a very big role, and we need to work everywhere to make that happen.
Absolutely agree with you there, Mark. So thank you for that. Rula, what are your opinions on sort of the importance that diversity has to play in this conversation?
Yeah, as Mark said, exactly the same. I think it's really important. Yeah, it's not just gender diversity, it's all types of diversity that need to have an input into this conversation, and also an input into, you know, how these algorithms are built, the data sets, the entire process needs input from various different groups.
Absolutely, thank you, Rula. And Katie, I'm going to come to you as well, because I know previously we've talked and you mentioned the invisible bias in data, the book that you recommended before as well. So what are your thoughts on sort of the impact of diversity when it comes to technology and also AI in particular?
Well, I think it's absolutely essential for all the reasons that Mark mentioned. You know, having a more diverse team, it will result in better products. That seems obvious at this point. And yeah, the book that you mentioned, Invisible Women, I recommend it to the group if you haven't come across it. It's all about how different systems have been built without using data from women. And the resulting impacts of that. It's pretty fascinating when you see, you know, some of the examples have to do with testing vehicle safety with only using crash test dummies that have typical male body proportions. And, you know, so they're completely missing what the impacts on a female body would be in the event of a crash. So it's fascinating. That's only one of very many examples in that book. But as Mark mentioned, it can't just be men and women. We need to be talking about full spectrum diversity across genders, across race and ethnicity. We also need to be looking at accessibility of the products. And since we have a younger audience here too, I'll also highlight age diversity is really important. And we've seen that bear out. I've seen it bear out in my own work. I've had the pleasure to work with some younger people recently who have brought, you know, a new perspective about the way that different technologies could be used, because they're using it differently than I did when I was their age, or than many of our colleagues did. And this is really important. Now we have younger users on WebEx because of the pandemic, and students are using it in the classroom. So we absolutely need to be factoring in age diversity too, as well as just, you know, that think about who's going to use the product and make sure that those perspectives are baked in. If you don't have them on the team, this is what we're telling our teams. If you don't have that perspective on your team, find a way to get it. Like maybe there's somebody else who works at Cisco who can bring that in, or we can tap our network of external experts and human rights organizations to help bring that perspective in as well. So I think it's absolutely essential, and it should be one of the critical components of any ethical AI and machine learning program.
Yeah, absolutely agree with that as well, Katie. Thank you. And just on that point of sort of the younger generations who, you may think of as digital natives, as you said, really leveraging the technology that many of us may not have used or been familiar with until a later age. Yes, they bring different perspectives to the table, but do you think they'll have a sort of different approach to the idea of machines making these consequential decisions? Do you think that idea will be different for sort of the younger generations coming into the industry?
I mean, I would be totally speculating. I'd be curious if anyone from the audience wants to chime in on this. My speculation would be that this generation seems to be more comfortable with technology, but I think they're still very focused on fairness, and any system that's making a decision should be fair. I think I would be surprised if that wasn't the case.
And Professor Mark, I can see that you're nodding along as well to some of what Katie's been saying. Do you have anything to add to this?
Yeah, I was nodding, especially to you're asking the question to the wrong people. You should be asking everyone else in this call, not the
Maybe we need to broadcast this one out to the audience.
Yeah, so I would just pass the question on.
Absolutely. Okay, well, we'll keep that open to the audience. I'd be interesting to hear sort of any messages or thoughts that our attendees have in the chat panel. So please feel free to pop them in. We're all interested in hearing your perspective on whether your idea and your approach to AI making consequential decisions is different to what we've been speaking about today. And Rula, I'll also just hand this over to you as well. Is there anything you'd like to add to this idea of sort of digital natives approaching this differently to how it would have been done before?
I guess so. Yeah, every generation handles tech and the challenges that it brings differently. So yeah. And sorry, I'm on a bus, so.
No worries at all. No, thank you for still being involved with this. I can tell you're on your way somewhere at the same time, so thank you. So I want to ask sort of one more final question here, and I'm really interested to hear the responses because I feel like it's quite a difficult question, so apologies in advance. But Professor Mark, I'm going to come to you for this first because you've sort of talked about it a little bit already. But what do we do next? What are the next best steps to work towards sort of the most ethical use of AI systems from here?
A tricky question. I mean, I don't actually work in ethical AI, but a couple of things that I think are worthwhile thinking about. First thing is always ask who benefits and who pays for it. So I think that's a question. And if you see there's one particular group that pays more than another one, then there may be an imbalance. So that's a question to ask. I think it's also important. I think Katie mentioned that earlier, to get the user involved more or less from day one, because you cannot design a product here and then ship it over here, and it just doesn't quite work because you make assumptions when you design your product, but on the ground or where this product is being used, maybe these assumptions are invalid. So that's the second point. And the third one is, if you build systems, any kind of like automated systems, scrutinize them very, very carefully. Think about explainability and transparency of those systems. And one way maybe to contribute to this is to open source code, the software that you write, and if possible, also open source the corresponding data that you use for training your models. I mean, I'm aware that this is not always possible, but try to make these AI systems as transparent as possible, because that allows other people to look at this and find bugs or problems in the reasoning that you used or that we use when we build those systems.
Yes, absolutely. I can understand really wanting to find anything that's not working the way you'd like it to before it goes ahead and makes these consequential decisions. So that's definitely a great point. So thank you for those 3 points that you gave. Katie, I'm going to hand over to you as our lawyer on the panel. What are your thoughts on sort of the best way to going forward in terms of having the most ethical use of AI?
Well, I will just go back to one of Mark's prior comments, which is about the prevalence or the growing prevalence of ethical AI teams at companies, and the scope of their mandate. And I think that this is something that all companies who are involved in designing AI and machine learning systems should have. And they should be empowered to make decisions, and to build a framework that is a requirement for engineering teams, not something that's voluntary. I think it has to be required. In my experience, engineers are eager to have some guidance on these issues, and but putting it in place so that it's something that they have to design to, I think will generate a higher level of uptake. So that's where I would start: is create the team, give them a mandate, and make it required.
So going back to that point of sort of there needs to be more than just the incentive, there needs to be some sort of enforcement behind it as well to make sure it's done correctly. So thank you for that, Katie. And Rula, last but not least, I'd love to hear your opinion on this matter as well.
I broadly agree with Mark and Katie, actually. So getting the user involved early, having incentives, but also enforcement. Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you very much. I feel like I asked a really difficult question to you three there, so apologies for that. And thank you so much for your insightful comments. So we've been hearing some responses as well from our audience based on how confident they feel in technology as compared to maybe sort of the older generations. So Sophie has said, personally, I'm far more comfortable trusting technology with important decisions than I think older generations were. And I think that's something that really resonates, just because growing up surrounded by technology is such a different experience to maybe what the older generations had faced, and them adapting to technology now sort of taking over the decisions that usually a human would make. I can understand maybe some discomfort around that trust process. So really great point from you, Sophie. Thank you very much for that. And actually, just to iterate what you're saying there, I gave the example at the start of the session about whether a judge could make a more ethical decision based on if a defendant should be granted bail or whether the AI could. And part of the results of that study that I read about meant the AI actually picked the defendants that were far less likely to be reoffending and should be granted bail, just because there was absolutely objective sort of analysis taking place in that sense, if you like. So it's really important to think about, do these studies really help emphasize what Sophie's saying in terms of AI should be trusted more? I'm sure there are many other studies that go the other way. That's just one that I read about that supports what Sophie's saying. We've got one more comment here as well that says, I think since our generation seems notably considerate and open to balancing the treatment of various demographics and minorities, I think, oh, excuse me, I've just lost it here. The issue of AI learning to be ethical will be handled quite well in the future. Professor Mark, how do you feel about that comment? Do you agree that it's more likely going to be handled well in the future because we've got a more open-minded generation now?
I'm getting a bit worried, actually. Don't trust these systems, question them, be critical, ask the difficult questions, because these systems are very, very far from perfect. Many of these systems, also the one that was mentioned earlier with, deciding whether people get out of jail or not on parole, that system was racist or is racist. And I spoke with, also like 2 or 3 years ago, with a company here in the UK where, they wanted to have like an AI decision-making system to decide whether people should get a credit or not, like a mortgage from a bank. And then they said they feed a lot of data into their system. And then they said, the most important feature that decides whether somebody should get a mortgage or not is whether their front garden is in order. So that is the thing this is the thing that the AI system picked up as a discriminator. Now you could think about which people can afford a house with a front garden, and then you can think about the postcodes and so on and so forth. But when I said this is a bit of a problem because you are having biases in your data set and you're making such important decisions, don't you worry, And they said, no, we are not worried. And these are people who build those systems and use them in everyday decisions, which are affecting everyone's lives. So I would be not trusting the AI system. I would try to question them as much as possible and be very skeptical about this. And this is coming from somebody who actually, I mean, you know, I like working in that sector, but do ask questions. Don't trust the systems. So that's kind of like my point that I want to make.
Thank you very much for that, Mark. And unfortunately, we are sort of at the end of our timeline. I'm really sorry to have to end it here. Thank you to everyone who's been putting in comments into the chat section. I am reading them as we go along, so thank you for that. And thank you to our fantastic panelists. It's been so eye-opening for me to speak with you all and to hear your insights. And I'm sure it would be absolutely the same for our attendees. So thank you all for your time.